CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Is the Eurozone heading for a sovereign debt crisis? Inflation hits 8.9% and Italian public borrowing is causing concern.
Our other headlines: Ukraine says it's ready and waiting for the signal to resume shipments of grain export through the Black Sea.
Callers on hold. Thousands of telecoms workers in the UK have gone on strike, demanding better pay.
The dirty little secrets of some of the biggest names in fashion accused of laundering the green credentials of their clothes.
And they've wowed the world with their sporting prowess, but will women's football score on the money? Eurozone inflation has hit a record high of 8.9%, with fears that it will continue to rise as the cost of living squeeze intensifies. However, second quarter Eurozone GDP expanded by more than 0.5%.
That was no thanks to Germany, whose economy stagnated, but Italy's GDP grew by 1% in the 3 months to June, and Spain's economy grew 1.1%. That's a marked acceleration from the near stagnation of the first quarter. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Giles Gibson, in Brussels. Giles, this is a bit of a mixed bag, isn't it? I mean, just talk us through these differing pictures of economies across the Eurozone.
Yeah, that's right. A mixed bag, a mixed picture when you look at the breakdown of the different economies, the different countries in the Eurozone, which make up these overall figures for the area. You know, you have Germany, yes, not sliding into a recession, but not growing either. You then have these economies in southern Europe who actually beat expectations pretty comfortably. You have Spain growing by 1.1% and Italy, its GDP expanding by 1% in Q2. That would translate into 4% growth on an annualized basis. There are a few things going on here. Of course, Germany is the powerhouse of the Eurozone. It's a big manufacturing economy, and it's most exposed to those restrictions in gas supplies that we've seen from Russia into the Eurozone. And then you have these economies in southern Europe, such as Spain, such as Italy, who are getting a real boost at the moment due to the return of tourists flocking back to the continent after a couple of really tough years for the tourism sector here in Europe. Despite those positive signs, though, we do have to keep underlining that overall inflation figure of 8.9%, which is record-breaking. Another month, another record. Of course, the last time we had a record was back in June. That was 8.6%, and now we have record-breaking figures all over again.
Giles, what's driving inflation in the Eurozone, and what's the European Central Bank doing about it?
Well, according to the breakdown that we got from Eurostat, which is the EU's official statistics agency, we are seeing prices going up for pretty much everything. You know, food, tobacco, alcohol, services, almost across the board. People are paying more for the things that they buy almost every single day. However, a really big contributor to all of this is energy prices. According to Eurostat, energy prices here in the Eurozone have gone up by almost 40% compared to the same time last year. Now, you ask what the ECB are trying to do about all this. We saw them taking some action very recently. Just last week, they announced they were raising interest rates by 50 basis points. That's 0.5%. That was the first time they'd raised interest rates in more than a decade, reversing this very long-standing policy of negative interest rates. They are really trying to walk this tightrope that we are seeing other central bankers around the world trying to do as well, you know, trying to rein in inflation, but also trying not to push economy over the edge into a recession. Really, though, we are hearing from more and more economists, more investment banks, such as Nomura in Japan, as well as Goldman Sachs in the US, that is exactly where the Eurozone is heading. Lots of people now forecasting that the Eurozone is heading for a recession in the next 6 months or 12 months. It varies according to who you speak to.
Giles, thanks for that. Giles Gibson, our correspondent in Brussels.
So that German economic growth stopped in the second quarter of this year, disappointing expectations of a slight expansion and triggering fears of recession. Our correspondent Trent Murray is in Berlin. So Trent, tell us more about these figures. Put them into context for us.
Yeah, Robin, I mean, Germany effectively ground to a halt in Q2. There had been some hope that there may have been a slight expansion after a 0.8% increase in the first quarter, but alas, it seems that the economy here really is slowing. Probably not a huge surprise given what we had seen in business sentiment surveys as well as some independent economic forecasts in recent weeks. But the real issue here, as Giles was saying, is that cost of energy. That is what the Statistics Office here in Berlin says is really driving the cost of living pressure in Germany and also what is hampering the economy. It is yet another very real world example, I suppose you could say, of how that conflict that we see in the far east of Europe is now starting to really have an economic impact and reverberate right across the west.
Winter may still be several months away, but already Germans are being warned that steps need to be taken now to avert an energy crisis in the colder months. With Russia cutting back the country's gas supplies, cities and towns are being asked to find ways to conserve energy, all part of an effort to divert what little gas is coming away from power generation and into storage.
We are, it has to be said, in the greatest energy crisis in Germany due to the dependence that's arisen politically and economically through Russian gas. But we are moving away from this dependency in no time at all.
Cities like Augsburg in southern Germany are trying to find ways to save, the mayor ordering streetlights to be dimmed and water fountains turned off.
What was very important to me was to show the Augsburg citizens that we are facing really hard times. These are not normal times, and to show that, we all need to look to really save energy.
Further north in Hanover, and hot water has been switched off at the city's swimming pools and sports centres. Citizens told there'll be cold showers from now on in all public buildings, while in Berlin, the city skyline is a little less bright. Officials ordering 200 bridges, churches and monuments to no longer be illuminated in the evenings. In isolation, these small steps may not seem like much, but the idea is that every little measure can add up to make a big difference. But the federal government is already warning people to brace for a financial hit as well, with a new surcharge being discussed to help prevent loss-making energy companies from going under. While a final decision is yet to be made, some reports suggest the levy could cost the average family up to $500 a year, meaning that for many households, efforts are already being made to cut back energy use as much as possible.
It's a big problem. It's, for example, young families, a lot of children living like in a city here in Berlin. I'm very worried for the next winter time here.
Ganze Nacht brennt dort Licht.
Lights are on in some buildings at night when there's nobody there working. This is a waste. Politicians open their mouths, but this is a waste. You don't need any lights on when there is no one working. They're always talking about saving, but they need to actually do something.
I think it has all been talked up too much. Of course, public information is important, but I think it is manageable. If everybody does their part, we can manage this. There is no need to worry.
Germany, like the rest of the EU, says the measures are part of a coordinated effort to reduce gas consumption overall by around 15%, a number they say should shield the bloc from shortages over the winter. But given how much uncertainty remains in Europe over Russia's future supply commitments, there's a cautious expectation that more cuts may yet be to come. Trent Murray, CGTN, Berlin.
Well, let's talk to Sandra Flippin, the chief economist at ABN AMRO Bank in the Netherlands. Sandra, welcome. One UK news journal tonight, The Spectator, is talking about a Eurozone sovereign debt crisis exacerbated by Italy. Is that over-egging it, or is that a fair picture of the Eurozone?
I wouldn't go as far as to call it a sovereign debt crisis yet, but the risks are certainly present, yes.
Eurozone inflation hits a new record of 8.9%. How much worse are you expecting it to get before it starts getting better?
A very hard question, because it depends on geopolitical factors that are hard stuff for economists to forecast. But so basically, what we're expecting now is that towards the end of the year, inflation will start slowly coming down. However, still remain way above target, might even be into the second half of 2023. And that is inflation. So basically, that's a year-on-year comparison of prices. The other thing is that we also have come to the conclusion that energy prices will probably stay high for maybe even quite some years. And the second thing that basically is going on since the war is that there is a lasting trade realignment going on. And that also takes several years to basically find to a new global trade. And both of those things are very costly and potentially price increasing.
For those of us who are not economists, it can be a rather confusing picture, can't it? Eurozone economy did grow in the second quarter, despite the energy crisis that you were talking about and that inflation surge. Do you think this is the last hurrah before things turn down?
Well, I think it's quite a nice description, actually, Jamie, because the thing is that my feeling is that there are two factors basically causing the discrepancy between growth, which is still all right, while inflation is already that high. And that is one, households actually very often have energy contracts. So, for example, we notice in the Netherlands, we actually measure what kind of contracts people have. And there we see that the amount of energy price increases that people are actually on a daily or monthly basis paying in their energy bill is by far not as large as energy inflation in the CPI shows. And this is quite important. It means that the inflation is basically much more slowly coming into people's purchasing power. That said, of course, there are many other prices that are rising. So food prices in the supermarket, everybody is feeling the difference. But that is an important nuance. And depending on the energy contracts that households, but also firms are having, basically is very important to understand the delay with which inflation is going to erode, productivity of firms and consumption of households. The other thing that is going on is that actually the second quarter is very much kind of a reopening feast after the last series of lockdowns in the Eurozone. And particularly the Southern European tourism industries, which have suffered so hard from the COVID crisis, are really making their way back right now in the second quarter. And that is something, that's something really positive, I would say. So that's, I guess, that's the reason why growth is showing a different picture than inflation right now.
And for people watching perhaps outside Europe, just give us some context on stagnation in Germany. Just how significant is this for Europe's largest economy and Europe?
Well, that is the big risk. I mean, there are actually many big risks right now heading towards Europe. It's the Italian crisis, it's the global financial tightening, but in fact, also what's going to happen to Germany, the economic powerhouse of Europe. Germany has the largest Russian gas dependence. Europe as a whole consumes 150 billion cubic meters gas on an annual basis, and we have to find a way to do without those billions of cubic meters. Now, I think what is interesting is a kind of a shift that we see in Germany in the last few weeks, where basically in first instance, it was always the consumer, the households that were going to be protected first and foremost, and that the industry would be shut down. Now, the Minister of Economic Affairs, Habeck, is actually has turned this around, and he said, well, that is a clear way to go, a clear strategy if it's a temporary energy crunch. We are now facing a more structural crunch, and the way to deal with that is to make everybody save as much as possible, firms and households, and then to be able to shut down industry as little as possible, because even households in the end will feel a massive burden if that would happen. And not only German households, but everybody in Europe would be suffering from that situation. So we all are basically hoping that the Germans succeed in getting as much energy savings as possible from turning the lights out, as we heard before.
Sandra, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. Sandra Flippen in Rotterdam.
China has indicated that it might not reach its annual economic growth target. The world's second-largest economy says it will try hard to achieve the best possible results this year as COVID restrictions weigh on growth. Beijing says the country will aim to keep growth within what it calls a reasonable range, without mentioning the 5.5% target it had set earlier. China's first-half GDP grew only 2.5%.
Apple's profits and sales in the second quarter rose 2% since last year to $83 billion, beating. The company says demand for iPhones remains strong despite rising inflation.
Oil company Chevron has posted record profits during the second quarter. Its adjusted earnings were $11.4 billion, or $5.82 per share. That was due to soaring fuel prices and high refining margins.
Bentley made more profits in the first half of this year than it did in the whole of last year. 2021 was a record-breaking year for the luxury brand. The Volkswagen Group brand posted profits of $405 million for January to June. Car sales rose 3% year-on-year to over 7,000 units. The best-selling model was the Bentayga SUV, which accounted for 40% of those sales.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. When is a recession not a recession? The argument raging in the United States. We're in New York next.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos and unicorn companies. Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliette Mann.
Soaring energy prices, surging inflation, strained supply chains. As costs spiral and goods run short, people are feeling the heat. Join us for a special new series, Crunch Time, starting August the 1st, here on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Consumer spending rose last month in the United States by 1.1%. It's the latest in a series of economic news this week, with the US Fed raising interest rates and the economy shrinking for the second consecutive quarter, signalling the unofficial start of a recession. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, who is in New York. So, John, an unofficial recession, but no agreement yet on whether to make it official.
No, I mean, we had the news early yesterday morning, Thursday here, and the U.S. economy contracted in the months between April and June by 0.9%, and in the first quarter it contracted by 1.6%. So, yes, technically that's a recession, but we've had so much pushback in the 24 hours, and there's a war broken out now between the Democrats and the Republicans over whether this is a recession or not. Janet Yellen, who's the Treasury Secretary, gave a press conference about noon here yesterday, said, no, nothing to see here. Move along the bus, please. Thank you very much indeed. And President Biden came out a couple of hours later and said what he said in the statement, which I read out yesterday, which is that this is no surprise and we're on the right path. Now, the Republicans are saying this is the Biden recession with one eye on the elections coming up in November. The Democrats are saying, no, just you wait and see. Let's see what happens. Republicans are also very angry at what appears to be a huge amount of public spending coming out of the Democrats right now. We'll get to that in just a minute. But Yellen has a point because hiring is very strong in America at the moment. The consumer remains very strong. And here's an example of that. We had very strong earnings from Apple and Amazon yesterday, with Apple buoyed up by sales of the iPhone to the tune of more than $40 billion, whereas $38 billion had been expected. And Amazon just doesn't seem to be being affected by inflation in the way that we thought it would. And it was propped up by its very important AWS, Amazon Web Services cloud business. They had a bit of a problem with their investment in the EV maker Rivian, but Wall Street's totally overlooking all of that. Amazon shares are up 3% and Apple is up 3% and Amazon is up by 10% after being up 13% when the news came out last night. All three markets here, Dow, Nasdaq, S&P 500, deeply in the green on this Friday for the third day in a row. So I think to sum it up, Robin and Jamie, technical recession, but everyone's looking the other way. And the reason is I think those first quarter numbers were a bit dubious. I think that's the thing. I think they could get round this by saying, well, the first quarter, we can't really be sure what those numbers actually were.
And John, we've talked before about the Chips Plus Act. That's now going to be signed.
Yes. It is. It's on the president's desk right now. He will sign it into law sometime today, I guess, or early next week. This is a very highly controversial bill, though, Robin and Jamie, and it's aimed directly at China. It's $52 billion worth of money to modernize and build chip factories across America. $39 billion will be for new factories. It'll benefit the likes of Intel and Texas Instruments in particular because they design and they manufacture their own chips. But a company like, say, NVIDIA, which does chips for video games, they don't manufacture, but they do design. So they won't get as much money, if any money, actually. It's about $89 billion in total if you add in all the pork, which is the term here used for what you have to add on to encourage these people to... There are guardrails for people like Intel. If they take the money, they won't be able to invest in an unrestricted fashion in China anymore. They're unhappy about that. Beijing is particularly unhappy about that, saying, well, we wouldn't do that to you. Why are you doing it to us? I think 17 Republicans voted for it in the Senate, 24 in the House. I think that's a lot to do with getting money into their states, to be honest with you. And I think the Republicans are very angry about what they say is now $850 billion of public spending that's suddenly coming down the pike. That's the China Chip Plus bill. There's $370 billion on the new BBB, the Energy and the Climate Change bill, and there's other stuff as well. And even some Democrats say, look, these chip companies don't really need this money. They're well off enough as it is. But Chuck Schumer, just finally, who is the majority leader in the Senate, said yesterday, look, if we don't do this, and we are now doing it, he said, it means that our grandchildren will have well-paid, good-quality jobs when we're in our dotage and our grandchildren are at working age. So, like all these things, you pay your money, you take your choice, really.
And John, what's the reaction been where you are to that phone call we talked about yesterday between President Xi and President Biden?
Yes. Well, I tell you, the reaction here is growing fears over Taiwan. Okay, they've sent the USS Ronald Reagan and the fleet that goes with her out of Singapore on its way to the Taiwan Straits. I think the American media is consumed with some kind of conflagration between Beijing and Washington over this issue of Taiwan, and in particular Nancy Pelosi, who's the Speaker of the House. She's on her way to Asia. She wants to go to Taiwan. The Chinese are very unhappy about that, and in this meeting, President Xi said, don't play with fire regarding that particular issue. There is a precedent, though, I have to say. Newt Gingrich, when he was the Speaker under President at the time of President Clinton in the 90s, he actually went to Taiwan. I do think the Chinese slightly misunderstand the point here. I think that there's a sense in Beijing that she's more important than she really is, if you know what I mean. And she is a very important American politician, don't get me wrong. But it's not like the president going, if you see what I mean. I think there's a bit of misunderstanding there. There's also a lot of talk here about the importance of this face-to-face that's coming up, probably at a G20 or something like that. It's thought that they can get along fine if they do meet face-to-face. And it speaks to the fact that everybody knows it here in America, that, you know, despite all the bad blood that there has been, and China is attacked every day in US media, particularly on the right. Everybody knows that these two giant economies have to get on together in the future. They're going to have to. And so a face-to-face, I think, is generally being welcomed.
John, thanks very much. Our correspondent, John Terrett in New York.
Tens of thousands of workers at the UK telecoms company BT and the phone network provider Openreach have gone on strike demanding better pay. It's the first national telecom strike since 1987. A second strike is planned for Monday. Let's talk to our correspondent, Andrew Wilson. Andrew, thousands of telecom staff on strike. What's the strike looking like? Tell us more.
Well, it's not good, Jamie. It's not good because BT is a strong company and has a good reputation, and they haven't had any industrial action in the company for 35 years. They've managed to keep their workforce happy, to expand, to move into broadband, to protect their position against streaming services and cable TV networks in keeping that presence in the broadband space. They functioned all through the pandemic. They gave bonuses to 60,000 staff after the pandemic or during it for their working under particularly difficult conditions. People attacking 5G masts, for example. Other engineers being attacked going about their work. I mean, it's been difficult times, and BT's gone through it, but it's just the inflation's too high. People worried about their money. The Bank of England's reporting consumer spending has gone up consumer debt, has gone up, doubled in the last month. People are already starting to resort to their credit cards, and so British telecom engineers, 28,000 engineers, 9,000 call centre staff, industrial action today, and again industrial action on Monday. It's not as effective as the rail strikes we've seen in the past week and we'll see during the summer, because people don't necessarily miss it when the telecom engineers aren't around. If there's no installations to be done, no repairs to be done, if you don't need to call the call centre, then you don't notice that they've been on strike, which weakens their position somewhat. But there are moves to modernise the company. 300 sites across the UK likely to be shrunk down to something like 30 in the next few years, and there's been a pay rise of 32% for the CEO, which has angered workers as well. It's an example of inflation biting, with workers really worrying for their futures and their families and the cost of living and energy and all the rest of it, and taking on the company. They were offered a 5% pay rise, which in normal circumstances would have been more than enough. No good this time round.
So telecoms workers on strike today. Last week we were talking about the railways bringing the country to a standstill. The prospect of industrial action at one of the UK's largest container ports. We keep hearing these mutterings of what's called a general strike. Are we set for a general strike?
A general strike is when unions across the country coordinate from all the different industries towards a collaborative strike action which lasts some time and has a particular political or economic agenda attached to it. The last official general strike in the UK was 1926, a long time ago, nearly 100 years ago, when 3 million of 5 million workers all went on strike at the same time for the best part of 9 days. We're not going to see that again, I fancy. We've got a 21st century model to look at rather than one from the early 20th century. But nonetheless, there are concerns about this summer of discontent, and the intended strike action from the workers at Felixstowe Port is a very acute example of that. Felixstowe is an extraordinarily important port. It's 45,000 containers go through that port a week. About 40% of the UK's travelling economy and goods goes in and out of Felixstowe. It's a hub, if ever there were one, of the whole UK economy. And if those workers go on strike, which they're planning to now in August, that could make things extremely difficult. Cast your mind back just a year to the Ever Given, the cargo ship that got stuck in Suez Canal. The knock-on effect that had to supply chains was extremely dramatic, and $400 million an hour was estimated to be lost in terms of the global economy because of that logjam in the Suez Canal. Well, a similar logjam at Felixstowe would have dramatic effects, not only on the European economy, but worldwide, because if a ship goes from Rio de Janeiro on its way to Rotterdam, it's more than likely it's going to have to stop in Felixstowe as well. So the upside of something as large and significant as that going on strike, of course, is that it gathers a certain momentum. There are civil servants that have to discuss their pay round, teachers that need to discuss their pay round, university staff, nurses, rail workers, again, from other units, all need to start discussing their pay rounds as we get towards the autumn. And when they see strike action like this taking place, matched to inflation coming up to 11%, well, it could start getting extremely difficult for businesses up and down the country.
Andrew, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Andrew Wilson.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. How green are your clothes? Red faces at some of the big fashion labels accused of laundering their environmental credentials.
What I show of China is what I really experience in China, and it's very different to what people in the West experience in China.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
I think it's fantastically important to educate British people about Chinese history and culture.
We have sown seeds which in China have grown to very big trees.
The values of horsemanship, respect, responsibility, compassion can be extended to all relationships.
My name is Max. I'm a food blogger. I grew up in China. Now I live in the UK.
We deserve respect, and the Chinese people with their own culture also deserve respect.
For cross-cultural understanding, I think food is a really good place to start. I hope to spread awareness of all the different cultures within China. I think there's a lot to share.
To increase understanding between cultures, I think time and patience is of course important, but the most important thing is responsibility.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and open up our world.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Is the Eurozone heading for a sovereign debt crisis? Inflation hits 8.9% and Italian public borrowing is causing concern.
Callers on hold. Thousands of telecoms workers in the UK have gone on strike, demanding better pay.
Ukraine says it's ready to resume shipments of grain exports through the Black Sea.
President Volodymyr Zelensky has visited the port of Chornomorsk to oversee preparations. He says shipments are expected to start in the coming hours. The United Nations brokered deal aims to release 25 million tons of grain from Ukraine's ports, blockaded by Russia since the invasion.
Our correspondent Stephanie Freed reports now from Odessa.
Certainly, Volodymyr Zelensky appearing at the port is a major hub, Chornomorsk, in the Odessa region. That adds some pressure to the process, but there's a lot to iron out. There has been a lot to iron out, specifically protocols in terms of ships that accompany the ships that are going to export goods from Ukraine. And the inspectors that will go on board, inspect cargo, make sure that no weapons or arms are being smuggled. And then there was a big issue around sweeping. We understand they're not going to demine the waters that were mined, but they're going to sweep and create a corridor for exports, ships to come in and out. So those were the fine details that were being hammered out. Certainly Volodymyr Zelensky's appearance at the port indicates that possibly, yes, something will happen quite soon, or it could be pressure There's no certainty of when exactly, but a lot that we're hearing around soon. Could that be hours? Could that be a day? Soon. Russia and Ukraine, they account for a third of the world's wheat and barley exports. The Middle East and Africa rely heavily on Ukraine grain exports. So the food crisis has been fueled by the conflict here and by these grains and shipments that are being held up in Ukraine's ports. The World Food Program, they rely on Ukraine for half of the wheat that they provide throughout the world. So if the exports start up again, that certainly will provide relief to the parties and to the countries that I mentioned. But again, you asked when it's going to happen, and that's the key. How fast will this happen? How quickly will this get underway? And how successful it will be? That, not forgetting that within 24 hours of Russia and Ukraine signing an agreement to restart exports, a Russian missile hit the port of Odessa. So there is some doubt around that. How successful will this endeavor really be?
Well, let's talk now to Associated Press correspondent Sam Mednick, who's in the Ukrainian city of Lviv. So, Sam, we've heard there about those blockaded grain shipments, but what's the latest on the fighting in Ukraine?
Attacks are continuing across the country today. Most significantly was an attack on a prison in the separatist eastern region of Ukraine, where 53 Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed and 75 were injured. This is according to Russian officials who say that it was Ukraine's fault for the attack, that Ukraine launched HIMARS missiles. These are long-range missiles that have been provided to Ukraine by the United States. Images of what Russia says was the attack site on Russian state media show a demolished roof as well as charred debris on the ground. Now, Ukraine is pushing back, saying that they had nothing to do with this attack. They're saying that Russia is trying to make it look like they're committing war crimes, and that what Russia is really trying to do is hide its human rights abuses against its prisoners, such as killings as well as torture. These prisoners who were in this prison are largely from the town of Mariupol, and they defended the Azovstal steel plant. This was a plant where people sheltered in for weeks and months at a time while the town of Mariupol was being decimated. In May, more than 2,400 of fighters surrendered themselves. Some of them have returned to Ukraine in prisoner swaps. However, many have not been heard from. Their families have no idea where they are. Now, this is just one attack among many in the last 24 hours. The Ukraine's president's office said that at least 13 people have been killed and 36 wounded across the country. In the northeastern city of Kharkiv, a two-story building was hit, and emergency officials were searching for survivors through the rubble. In the southern region of Mykolaiv, the governor said that 4 people were killed when a missile hit a bus stop. The governor said that Russia is changing tack and that it is focusing because Ukraine is having success in its counteroffensive in the southern region of Kherson. The Washington-based think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, has said that Russia is losing ground in the southern region and Kherson as Ukraine continues its counteroffensive, and that Ukraine is continuing to hit key infrastructure, like bridges, that Russia needs in order to get military and personnel into the areas that it occupies.
Sam, thanks very much. That's Sam Mednick from the Associated Press in Lviv.
3 major fashion brands are being investigated by the UK's competition watchdog over their claims of sustainability. ASOS, Boohoo and Asda's George brand could face legal action if it's found they misled customers with eco-friendly credentials on their products. This follows a review by the Competition and Markets Authority, which looked at greenwashing within the clothing industry. Well, let's talk to Justin Urquhart-Stewart, the co-founder of 7 Investment Management. Justin, welcome back to the programme. Do you think consumers really care? Do investors care? We just want a cheap T-shirt for $1, don't we?
There's the difference. Consumers really don't care very often at all. But investors, yes, they do care, because increasingly we have this movement towards, well, I suppose the fashionable tag, as you say, greenwashing, but respectful greenwashing. They put it down as 3 initials now, ESG. Environmental, sustainable, and with governance. And that's to say, are the companies operating profitably and properly, and within not just the law, but in the style of the law as well, living up to their claims that they put in their marketing? And if they don't, then actually finding investment firms will react against it. Now, we've seen this mostly with regard to environmental issues, particularly oil companies and things like that. But increasingly now it's on the fashion companies who will often come up with statements such as, this is 100% recycled plastic or whatever it is. Of course, none of us know. We can't prove it at all. We're just still working on the basis of what the company tells you. Well, hardly surprising, some of them ain't true.
And do you think it's just the fashion industry, the fashion sector that's being nailed at the moment, or is this across the board?
They'll take it in turns, no doubt. They'll find other areas. Certainly my own interest in terms of financial services is appalling at it in terms of what's the sort of telling the truth. Really rather difficult, I think, for that industry. How much do they charge and how much value do they actually provide? There are good people and there are bad people. There's a regulator there to make sure they're brought to justice, but not always very effectively. But no, this is going to actually eventually be across the board, not just in companies in Europe or the UK, but internationally as well. Why? Well, because actually there are an increasing number of pension funds who say that they will only invest in these sort of businesses. Mind you, there is an issue here. If you're going to put yourself up as a saintly investor doing everything correct, you've still got to make sure you make good returns to your clients. So here's the issue. Do you make more money out of sin companies, say like oil companies and tobacco companies, or can you make money out of the good guys who are doing things properly? And actually, history tells us that most of the time, investing properly and respectably actually normally wins out. The trouble is, what you regard as something which is ethical may be actually something deeply unpleasant to somebody else. So it varies unless you can have a proper standard.
What do you think will happen to these companies if indeed they are found to have used misleading eco-credentials?
Well, a couple of things to be done is, A, exactly what we're doing now, which is making sure they've got some publicity waving above them, saying that actually these people aren't necessarily telling the truth, or more point, go and check to see if they're telling the truth. And then after that, then the regulator can impose fines and can actually, we haven't actually seen anybody go to prison as yet, but certainly the corporate can have sufficient action taken against it to impact their bottom line, i.e. to affect their performance, therefore affect their share price, and to most company directors and investors, that is the bottom line.
Justin, thank you very much for that. Justin Urquhart-Stewart.
More than 5 trillion tiny pieces of plastic litter our oceans. CGTN's Juliette Mann has been investigating microplastics, how they make their way into the sea and even our bodies.
Billions upon billions of items of plastic waste are choking our oceans. Studies show around a truckload of plastic is dumped in the ocean every minute. It's harmful to plants and wildlife and is a growing threat to human health. Much of the rubbish in our ocean ends up microplastics, pieces of debris smaller than a grain of rice, under 5 millimeters long. It's estimated there are now more than 5.25 trillion of them littering our ocean floors, and they're ending up in the human food chain. A recent report showed 83% of tap water samples from major metropolitan areas around the world have been contaminated with plastic fibres. 93% of bottled water tested showed some sign of microplastic contamination too. Microplastics come from everything from food wrappers to cosmetics, car tyres to paint and clothing. For example, a single fleece jacket sheds up to 250,000 microfibres during a single wash. And this year, for the first time, scientists have found microsamples of plastic bottles and carrier bags in human blood, which means these tiny particles can travel around the body and get lodged in organs like the lungs.
And you can see more about microplastics on the agenda with Juliette Mann this weekend here on CGTN.
A UK judge has delivered a ruling in a high-profile court case which became known as the Wagatha trial. Footballer's wife Rebecca Vardy has lost her libel case against Colleen Rooney, the wife of former England football captain Wayne Rooney. Vardy sued Rooney for defamation after she accused her of leaking private information to the media. But the judge ruled that Vardy was likely responsible for those leaks.
Britain's High Court has rejected the latest efforts by Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to gain control of more than $1 billion of his country's gold reserves stored at the Bank of England. Maduro says Venezuela needs the money to deal with the pandemic, but the opposition leader, who the UK recognises as the country's president, says Maduro wants to use the money to pay off his foreign allies.
Aid has been airlifted to some parts of the Philippines as people caught up in its earthquake try to find food and shelter. Authorities say 7 towns in Abra province have been cut off due to aftershocks and rain. Nearly 1,600 homes were damaged. Many people are camping out in parks and open spaces.
In the United States, at least 15 people were killed when flash flooding submerged parts of Kentucky. The National Guard and state police are using helicopters and boats to rescue those trapped by the surge. The state governor declared an emergency and appealed for federal help, saying the damage could take years to repair.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Women's football scores with the fans ahead of this weekend's Euros final. But will it reach its financial goals?
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country. There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Women's football has attracted new audiences all around the world ahead of Sunday's Euros final between England and Germany.
But will this surge in interest translate into more money for the women's game? Simon Chadwick is director of the Centre for Eurasian Sport.
Well, we're seeing some promising signs. We've got countries like Norway, for example, where they already pay their men and women the same amount of money for playing football, which is clearly something that the rest of the world has to look towards replicating. That is a good start. I think more generally, if we look at, for instance, Grand Slam tennis tournaments, increasingly now we're seeing men and women paid the same amount of money for winning tournaments. And so we are on the cusp of really quite a dramatic change, I think. And what we've not got to do is we've not got to lose heart, lose focus, let our attention wander off, and we've got to ensure that the positive moves forward that we've made continue. And I think that with that, it's a virtuous circle, because if women's football is getting coverage, if that coverage then leads to more commercial revenues, more sponsorships, if that in turn leads to greater public acceptance and people are spending more on women's football, then what we have is we've got more money going into women's football. And if women's football gets better as a consequence of the investment, the virtuous circle goes on. So, but certainly from my perspective, having watched football for decades, it feels very, very different now, certainly from a British perspective, than it has ever felt before. And as I say, I think we're on the cusp of something special.
And you mentioned sponsorship. Does the increased attention around this perhaps open the door for some big money deals, the likes of which we see more often in the men's game?
I think it probably does. Quite how quickly we'll get there remains to be seen. One of the things that we obviously do know is that people do want to watch women's football. So in terms of the business and finance of football, that's important. I think what we also have started to realise as a global sporting community is women also have money. Women do spend their money on things. It's not just men that have money. And so what we're seeing is not just sponsors spending more, existing sponsors spending more. We're seeing new sponsors coming into the game, and these new sponsors very often are targeting products at women and women who have disposable income are prepared to spend. And so the overall complexion, I think, of the business and finance of women's football is actually changing, because it's not just if you like a kind of copy of the men's world. It is actually it's developing in its own right, with its own tournaments, with its own teams being specifically set up. You know, some amazing teams in the United States, great concepts being established. I think we're seeing the football community and European football clubs, for example. It's now very common for the likes of Manchester United and Barcelona to have women's teams as well as men's teams. So we really are heading towards a situation where there will be parity, there will be equality. And that won't be just in terms of having a men's team and a women's team. It will come in terms of we've got a multi-million-pound or multi-million-dollar deal for men's sponsorships, but we've also got a multi-million-dollar sponsorship for women's football too. So I don't think we're necessarily going to get there in the next 12 months, but certainly within the next 10 years, we will see much, much greater parity, much greater equality between the two editions of the sport.
Jerry Gray and his Chinese wife Anne Liang have cycled and walked thousands of kilometres across China, raising nearly $500,000 for poverty alleviation and people with disabilities, recording their experiences in their travel blogs.
As a Westerner who's lived and worked across China for 18 years, Jerry has a unique perspective on China's economic transformation.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers. Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and open up our world.
My name is Jerry Gray. I am British-born citizen and I lived in Australia for a short while, but in 2004, about 18 years ago, I came to live in China, in Zhongshan, Guangdong. My idea was to travel the world with this portable skill of teaching English, and my first job was in China. That was in 2004, and I never left. I decided that I was going to stay in Zhongshan, and I decided to go looking for a job, and I went to a language center and met the manager there, and that's Anne.
Yes.
She was my boss.
Oh, I see.
Still is.
I found that foreigner or Western man is more direct to express their feelings, their love.
We are obviously from different cultures, but because both of us have traveled widely, both of us have experience of the other culture, I don't think it's such a broad difference. There was a bridge already there before we ever met each other. We were comfortable with each other's cultures before. My wife and I got involved in charity work in 2005.
Our charity basically now is helping the disabled people in Zhongshan.
And the government does help disabled people, but we can add to that.
Disabled people doesn't get much attention from society, so we decide to maybe focus on disabled people.
Myself and another foreign friend, an Irish guy, decided to ride to Xinjiang. When I decided to do this bike ride, I thought it might be an idea to link the two together, and it created a bit of publicity. It generated a lot of interest. So we basically traveled north from Guangdong into Hunan, into Hubei, into Shanxi, Gansu, Ningxia, and then across to Xinjiang. I had a feeling that I hadn't completed a journey, and I wanted to ride from Urumqi back to Zhongshan. And Anne kind of encouraged me to do it, so we kind of got to the point where if I'm going to do it, let's do it together. We flew to Urumqi, had the bikes shipped to Urumqi, and then rode home. So that's a reversal of my first ride. So again, we touched the same provinces and regions. It kind of snowballed, it rolled and got bigger and bigger, and we had Zhongshan television covering us every day. They would call me in the afternoon and say, "Where are you now? How far have you come?" When we got back, we had a function, an event, and that raised a lot of money. Your walk is even more, yeah.
Me and another American girl, We walked from Zhongshan to Beijing 4.5 months, and 2,500 kilometers. We mostly just stay in cheap hotels, camp a few times in mountain, but safe, quite safe. We didn't meet any dangerous situations, not at all.
We raise funds so we can donate, and we focus very much on the disabled community here in Zhongshan. We used to try and help people who were poor, and we found that the government are doing that pretty well now anyway, so we tend to focus more on disabilities and helping disabilities to become more assimilated in community. Yeah. And you wouldn't see disabled people, now you do. And that's the beauty of how China is changing. And I'd like to think we had something to do with that by raising attention more than raising the money.
So far, if we count it from 2005 to now, it's more than 3 million. We collect the money, but we donate it to, to
an organization that uses it.
Yeah.
The reason I started blogging was because we were locked down, and I thought, well, I'll share China. I'll share my experiences of China, and that's how it happened. I started posting photographs and stories linked to photographs, and then I started writing articles about it. From 2015 to 2020, my Twitter site had 2 followers and 1 tweet, or maybe 2 tweets, and now it's just a shade short of 45,000 followers. I've seen lots of changes in China. When I first came here, it was almost impossible, for example, to get a coffee, and I'm a coffee addict. Pretty much everything that I used to miss, I can now find here. If you want to find out what's happening in China, ask people who are in China, with poverty alleviation, rural revitalization, incredible infrastructure in the last 5 years. We've got bridges to Hong Kong, we've got high-speed trains. All of this is in the last 5 to 10 years. So anyone who was here in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, the China they knew is not the China of today, and that's the most important thing that I can put across.
Westerners, they don't understand China, so I think better for them to come over and look around and have their own experience in China.
I've ridden across China from north to south, from east to west, and from west to east. So I've done probably 30, maybe 35,000 kilometers on a bike in China. So I get to know pretty well.
And to find out more about Jerry and Anne's story, visit our website and social media platforms.
The headlines again. Is the Eurozone heading for a sovereign debt crisis? Inflation hits 8.9% and Italian public borrowing is causing concern.
Our other headlines: Ukraine says it's ready and waiting for the signal to resume shipments of grain exports through the Black Sea.
And callers on hold. Thousands of telecoms workers in the UK have gone on strike, demanding better pay.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again on Monday, same time, same place. From all the team in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.